Hey friends, Matt aka Martin here. Welcome back to another video. Today I'm going to be showing you how you can make your very own snare drums inside of Ableton Live using my new Snare Designer Rack. We're going to go through what the Snare Designer Rack is, some of the basic concepts behind it, and how to use it, as well as make some snares using it. And if you'd like to grab the Snare Rack and follow along for yourself, you can head down to the link in the description where you can buy the rack for yourself over on my Buy Me a Coffee page. I'm looking to transitioning over to something like Gumroad or something shortly, but for the moment it's just on my Buy Me a Coffee page, so head to the link down in the description and you can get it for yourself. Before we get started, as per usual, if you like the video, make sure to drop a like and a comment down below, subscribe if you're new, and if you head on over to my Buy Me a Coffee page, you can also support me as well as grab the snare rack that I'm going to go through in this video and get some really cool stuff in the process. So without any further ado, let's jump into Ableton Live and let me show you how this snare rack works and how you can use it and the concepts behind it to create your very own snare sounds. Okay, so here we are inside of Ableton Live and I'm going to go up to my favorites and we have Martin's Snare Designer project in the browser right here, and you can see inside of here we have a few different racks. I'm going to load up the default rack, and this is what we're going to use to start making some snares. By default, the rack sounds like this. The other devices in here are just all presets of this particular rack. So we have a clap sound, a more dubsteppy type snare, a grainy-ish snare, a metallic kind of snare, and a kind of cool watery type snare. Let's go back to the default one, and this is what we're going to start making some sounds with. So before we actually go into making any sounds with this rack, I want to talk a little bit about some kind of snare sound design theory, which will break down some of the core concepts behind how this rack actually works. So when we're thinking about designing a snare sound, we kind of break it up into three different parts. We have our transient, we have our body, and we have our tail. And this particular rack is designed to give you independent control over those three different aspects of a snare. The transient and the tail are both created using samples, which are sounds that I've designed myself and put into this rack. And the body is synthesized using Ableton Live's operator device. And we're able to control the amplitude envelopes of each of these different components of the snare individually and independently using Ableton Live's Shaper MIDI device, or rather my edit of Ableton Live's Shaper MIDI device, which adds a few extra cool features. So if we take a look at the rack, we can see we have a whole bunch of macros here, and in the middle we have this kind of envelopes section, which allows us to access the amplitude and other envelopes, which we'll go through in a little bit as well for each of the different sections or components of the snare. And then at the end we have a shaper section, which allows us to just add some extra processing to the snare to beef it up and make it really sound how we want. So as an example, we have the very first control here is the rate, which determines the rate of the shaper. Currently, if I turn this up, we lengthen the sound. And if I slow it down or turn it down, we speed up the sound. Make it much snappier. And then this yellow section here is all to do with shaping the transient of the sound. If I turn down the volume of the body and the tail, we just get the transient. We turn down the volume of the verb as well. And we can tune the transient. We can select the transient from a bunch of different samples. We can add a high pass filter. And we can adjust its volume. And then if we come over to the right a little bit, we get access to control the amplitude envelope of this transient using Ableton Live's Shaper MIDI device. Now the rate of the Shaper MIDI here is determined by the rate control macro on our left. And this yellow line is effectively the amplitude envelope that the transient follows. I can extend this out, maybe choose a different transient. I could make it a bit longer. All these transients are quite short by default, so I can make it a bit quicker. And it's important to note that this rate control affects all of the different components of the snare. So let's get a transient that we're happy with. I'm going to make this really snappy. I can curve it a little bit as well. Maybe make it flatten out at the start and then kind of come down a little bit here. I'm going to add some high pass to it, so it's just really kind of snappy, and then we're good to go. Now let's increase the volume of the body. And you can hear as I do that, we start to get a little bit of a kind of tone to this snare. I can change the fundamental frequency of this tone by going to the fundamental control. So if I want to have a higher pitched snare, I can do that, or a lower pitched snare. Let's go 180. And I can also change kind of the tonality of the body a little bit by increasing the body tone, which actually just adds a little bit of frequency modulation to that fundamental frequency. And much like the transient, if we go over to the right, we can click on the body section here, and I actually get access to change the amplitude envelope and the pitch envelope of the body. So because I don't want the body overlapping completely with the transient of the sound, I'm actually going to have the body fade in a little bit up to the point where the transient begins to fade out. So about that first division right here, which is pretty much what it's already doing. I'm going to pull it back a little bit. There we go. Now I want to increase the length of the body a little bit, so I'm going to drag this out a bit. Delete this particular point right here. Maybe increase that a little bit. Maybe do something like this, and maybe we'll have this kind of flat for a little bit as well, which is fantastic. And then we get access to change the pitch envelope of the body as well. So I can make it start really high or start a little bit lower. And you can kind of hear the difference that makes when there's that really drastic pitch drop. It's quite a clicky sound. When it's a little bit less drastic, get a little bit less of a click. So I can expand that out a little bit more. And we're already starting to get a little bit of a snarey type sound. Now we can adjust the volumes of these two, so I can turn down the body volume a little bit. And now we get to move on to the tail. So the tail, much like the body and the transient, has its own independent amplitude envelope, as well as a tuning, selector, high pass filter, and then the overall volume control as well. So if we increase the volume of the tail to about -7 or something like that, -6, we start to hear some kind of noise coming in there. I can increase the tune of the tail, which is pretty cool. I can change the selection of the tail, so the sample that it's using. So there's a kind of cool one. And then I can also add a high pass filter to it as well. Maybe about 500 hertz is pretty nice here. And now we can go to the tail amplitude envelope and adjust some parameters. So here you'll see we also have two shaper MIDIs. One is controlling the amplitude, the other is controlling an EQ movement, which is kind of cool. So here I can extend this out a little bit. Maybe I want the tail to last for a little bit longer. And I kind of want the tail to come in as the body is fading out. So if I reduce the length of the body here a little bit, we can have the tail starting about there. And once again, the length of these are all tied to the rate control, so I can increase my rate a little bit. Maybe I can tune up the tail a little bit. Maybe I can turn down the body volume slightly. Maybe the tail volume slightly too, which is kind of cool. And now we have the beginnings of a cool snare sound. Now this EQ envelope here, you don't particularly want to mess with it too much, but it is really fun to play around with. You can get some interesting timbral shifts. So for instance, if I extend this out a little bit, and if I maybe make it a little bit more drastic in terms of the curve, we get a bit more of a sweep upwards at the end of the snare. And you can kind of play around with this to adjust the tonality of the snare a little bit. Now, our last little section in this main point here is the verb control. And this allows us to add a little bit of reverb to the snare, but in a way that is controlled by, again, an envelope. So I'm going to go to the verb envelope section. And this verb envelope section allows me to adjust the amplitude envelope of a reverb. So I can increase the volume, I can increase the time, and you can hear a reverb kind of fading in and out really quickly here. And the volume of this reverb is controlled via this amplitude envelope, or this shaper MIDI device right here. I can have it come in quicker, and I can have it maybe not fade out all the way. Maybe turn down the time a little bit. Or I can do some really interesting things, maybe have it come down and then fade up and then kind of do this weird thing like this if I want to add some weird movement to the snare. Kind of adds a bit of like a pre-delay, which is quite cool. I can turn down the volume of this. And then I finally have a fine-tune control here, which allows us to adjust the fine-tuning of the snare in hertz. And you saw how really quick and easy that was to get a nice sounding snare. Now, all of this stuff here is controlling stuff in the inside section right here, which I won't kind of go into because it's a little bit of a mess, but effectively inside here, there are 3 different instrument racks. One is a sampler, houses all the different transients. One is a operator device, which is basically creating the body, and the other one is another sampler device, which is creating or housing all the different samples for the tail. And all these have a few different things inside them that are being controlled by these Shaper MIDI devices at the start. Again, I won't go into all these. If you want to figure out how this all works, you can go and buy and download the rack for yourself and check it out. But it's taken me a little bit of a while to figure out, but I think I've gotten something that's pretty cool. So we're going to close that down now, and we're going to move on to the shape section here at the end. So this shape section is pretty simple. It allows us to add some noise to the snare. This is just using a vocoder device to add some noise. We have the ability to kind of add some over-the-top compression using the OTT control, which particularly when there's reverb really brings out that reverb, so you might want to turn that down a little bit. Maybe turn down the amount of OTT. And then we have a transient control, which is using drum bus to kind of shape the transient of the sound a little bit. So make it a little bit punchier, or make it a little bit less punchy. And then we have some basic EQ controls here. We have a high pass filter to cut out those nasty lows. And we have a mids control and a high control. And then we have the ability to add some more reverb after the fact in case we want to have both this kind of envelope controlled reverb, and then I can add some further reverb at the end with this space control. Maybe increase the decay time a little bit, pull down the room size, add some pre-delay, pull down the space a bit. And then we have 2 final controls at the end. We have a squash, which is effectively a saturator plus limiter combo, which gets really gnarly when we have that reverb in there. So I'm going to pull that down a little bit. And then we have a final output control, which just allows us to attenuate the output slightly if we want to. And you'll see that all of the presets are all gain matched to -1 dB. Which I highly recommend just so you don't get any kind of random overs. And so there you can see how we can really quickly design a cool snare sound using this rack. But the snare rack is not actually just limited to snare sounds. And in fact, we can do some really wild things by playing around with these Shaper MIDI amplitude envelopes to get some really crazy cool sounds. Let's take a look at that now. So here I've just opened up the default snare rack again, which for reference sounds like this. Now what I'm going to do is actually just go into the body and the tail and the verb envelopes here, and I can just randomize these. So let's randomize the body amplitude envelope. Let's randomize the tail amplitude envelope a little bit and maybe just pull these around a little bit. And you start to get some really interesting kind of texturally sounds. Let's pull down the body a little bit. I don't want that lingering, so I'm going to completely pull that down. Let's maybe change the pitch envelope slightly too. Start to get like kind of watery. I can pull down the body volume. Maybe let's add a little bit more of this transient in. Change the different transient to select something else. Pull down the tail and the body a little bit more. Change the fundamental. And maybe decrease the rate a little bit. Maybe increase the rate even. Increase the tail. And you can turn this from a snare designer into a really interesting sound design tool. Now, of course, you aren't limited to just using this snare rack in its default form. You can add further processing. You can bounce out the snares as samples and stuff like that and further manipulate them there. But the purpose of this snare rack is to give you really easy and quick access to all of the fundamental controls that you will need when creating a snare drum from scratch. And all the samples in here, including the transients and the noise / tail samples, are all kind of designed to work really well together and in this particular snare rack. Now I might do some updates to this further on down the line, maybe add some kind of info controls or information to each of the different macro controls and everything here, so you kind of get a bit more of an understanding of what's going on inside of the rack itself. But for the moment, I think this is a really, really cool rack that I've been using a bunch myself, designing some really cool snare sounds, which you can download for free. I'll put a link down in the description. And yeah, if you enjoy this, make sure to go and check it out for yourself. And so there you have it. I hope you enjoyed this video showing you how to make your very own snare sounds using my new Snare Designer rack. If you want to download the rack, make sure to head down to the link in the description where you can buy it for yourself. And if you want to download any of the snares that I've made using this rack as an example, you can do so for free by heading to another link in the description where you can grab some example snares so you can check out exactly the kind of sounds that you can make with this rack. All of those are going to be hosted on my Buy Me a Coffee page. I'm going to be looking at transitioning over to something like Gumroad or something kind of soon, but for the moment, everything's just over on my Buy Me a Coffee page, so feel free to head on over there and grab the rack and some samples for yourself. As per usual, if you like the video, make sure to leave a like and a comment down below, subscribe if you're new, and feel free to check out this video right here where I go through Shaper MIDI, which is one of the main devices that I actually used in the creation of this snare rack. That's it for me, and I will see you all in the next video.